So thank you so much, Alan. And I am Ryan Jayne. I'm going to be stuck behind the computer to be changing my slides. So when I can, I'll be out here so I can actually stand in front of you and chat. So I am Senior Policy Counsel with the Freedom from Religion Foundation. And for those of you who are not aware, FFRF was founded in 1976. So it's a state church organization that's been a presence in America for quite a long time. But we've really picked up steam and size in the last 10, 15 years. I've been there for 8 years, and when I came to FFRF right out of law school, we had, I think, about 20,000 members nationwide, and now we've just crested 40,000 members, so we've doubled in that size. And mostly that's good news, of course. You know, it's great to have more supporters, but the kind of flip side of it that I always try to keep in mind is that part of the reason that people choose to support an organization like FFRF is because they are reasonably very concerned about the state of the country. And so, for example, when the 2016 election happened, there was so much just panic, so much fear of the future that it was, unfortunately, it was job security for people like me who are trying to play defense against the forces of Christian nationalism trying to take over the country. When people see this as a real threat, they look for organizations to support. But I'm happy to say that this is it's my dream job, it's my passion to just wake up every morning and get to fight for state-church separation. There's nothing I would ever rather be doing. I have never been religious personally, but I've always been alarmed at how when religion impacts our public policy, I see that it just makes everything worse. It just has these wide-reaching tendrils, and every part of public policy it touches on, it manages to affect for the worse. And so that's why, as someone who doesn't come from a religious perspective, it was very easy for me as an outsider to come in and say, this is a common thread that I can work against from the policy perspective. And initially, when I graduated from law school, got into the state church world, my thought was, I want to be a litigator. I want to be fighting lawsuits in court to stop state church separations. That was my dream. And I did that for a number of years. I was part of our litigation team. I think we did some fantastic work at the time, but things have really shifted. We're still doing a lot of litigation, and I still help out with that, but I have shifted my focus, and I think as a movement, we kind of have to shift our focus as well, because the reality is we are not going to win the state church battle in the court of law. There's a number of reasons for that, which I'll touch on in my presentation, but the bottom line is we need to be utilizing the demographics that are moving in our favor. We have younger people and people generally who are less religious than ever, more plugged into evidence-based thinking, reason-based policy, but also the courts are less reliable than they ever have been before. So it's not going to be a reliable path to think that clever lawyers are going to just lawyer our way through this. What we need to do is focus on education and focus on dispelling cynicism. So that is what I'm going to be asking all of you. We'll be talking about different, paths forward, next steps, all the different things you can all do to help. But when it comes down to it, I think that's where we need to focus. We need to be winning over people's minds, reminding them why state-church separation is important, and then getting them actively involved in our democracy so that we can make things better. So with that said, I am going to jump into my slides here a bit. So first of all, I was just talking about federal courts, and for those of you who don't know, our country is divided into what are called circuit courts. And Iowa is part of the 8th Circuit. So what that means is if you have a federal court decision, you would be in one of the Iowa district courts. There's the Northern and the Southern District Court. But when that gets appealed, it goes to the 8th Circuit. And that's the same Court of Appeals that governs all those other orange states in the middle as well. So it's one body of case law that dictates what happens there, unless the next step would, of course, be the U.S. Supreme Court makes laws for or decides the interpretation of laws for the entire country. So that's kind of the picture that we're dealing with. And the Eighth Circuit is quite a conservative circuit. It is one of the circuits of many that Trump and McConnell managed to just pack full of young conservative ideologues who are by and large hostile to state-church separation. So that's one of the reasons that things are difficult. If you have a situation pop up in Iowa or in Minnesota, for that matter, anywhere else in there, even if you win at the district level, you're going to have to deal with an appeal to the Eighth Circuit, and that's going to be an uphill battle. And then the only recourse after that is to go to the U.S. Supreme Court, which is, of course, also quite out of whack right now. So that, to put it mildly. So this is the environment that we're dealing with when we're thinking about state-church litigation. So with that said, I am going to focus a lot on legislation instead. And this is where I will recommend a lot of you focus your energy as well. A big part of my job in the early part of each year is tracking legislation. We track bills in all 50 states and federally, and anything that has to do with state-church separation we are interested in. And as I said, when religion is in public policy, it likes to just touch all sorts of different areas. So we are, even though we're sort of hyper-specialists in a way with state-church separation, we kind of have to be generalists as well, because there are so many different areas of the law where there's some take that religious lawmakers want to impose, and we have to be there to push back. So with Iowa specifically this year, in 2023, the legislature met from January until May, and it's a very busy season for a few months, and that's common in a lot of states. So it's with my position and my team, we are basically just completely focused on tracking and either supporting or opposing bills from January until the summer, especially of odd-numbered years, which is the first half of most legislative sessions. And then the lawmakers basically take summer break. A lot of them don't come back until January. Some of them, come back in the fall, but not for very long and not as concerted of a way. So it's really this blitz from the beginning of the year until summer. And Iowa is no exception. We had 26 bills that we were tracking in Iowa this year. Of them, 22 were bad, which is not shocking if you're familiar with the legislature in Iowa. There was one good bill that we really liked. It did not pass, but SF 322 would have brought transparency to the new voucher scheme, which I will be diving into quite a bit in a minute, and then 3 neutral bills as well. In terms of the bills that actually passed, the good news when you're dealing with a tough legislature like Iowa is that most bills do not pass. That's just a reality of our democratic system. Most bills, if you know the process, most bills go to a committee and die there. That's just what happens. It's a rare minority of bills that make it through the entire schoolhouse rock, how a bill becomes a law process and actually makes it over the finish line. So when you're playing defense, that's good news. A lot of the stuff, even though you see it and you say, oh my God, this is the worst bill I've ever seen, it's probably not going to pass. But in the case of the voucher bill, where we knew that this was Governor Reynolds' top priority from the prior year, it's not shocking that bill passed. And then the other bill I'm going to talk about a bit is a book banning bill with a Bible carve-out. So let's talk about that one first. So this is SF 496. It's a book ban and a version of Florida's Don't Say Gay bill. And this passed, and what it does is it basically, in addition to the book banning details, which I'll get into in a sec, it forbids teaching about gender identity and prohibits publications that depict sex acts. Specifically, before 7th grade, it prohibits schools from providing instruction about gender identity or sexual orientation. So this is the don't say gay aspect of it. The most alarming part of it, to my mind, would be, of course, I have an elementary school age child, and something that they regularly talk about is family constellations. Talk about these are my brothers, these are my parents, these are my cats, and it's suddenly this conundrum for a first grade teacher. If you have a student who has 2 dads, what are you going to do? Are you just not going to do this project at all where you're labeling out who your parents are? Because if you do, you're inviting these questions and you're, I guess, going to have to dodge them when people ask, why does Billy have two dads? It's like, well, I guess we're not allowed to talk about that, which is just abhorrent. And of course, it is the result of religious strong-arming, which is why FFRF cares about it. Now, recently, some of you may have seen there was an announcement that Urbandale Community School District, which is interesting. When I was reading about this, I was curious that they actually have a full year school. I don't know if this is news to all of you, but this was very much news to me that they have an elementary school, I think it was, that doesn't take summer vacation. So they are, in their new year and are trying to figure out what to do with this new law that passed. And so what they did is they identified 374 books that they deem to likely violate the new law due to depicting sex acts. And so they basically have told schools in the school district that if you have any of these books in your libraries or in your curricula, you need to get rid of them, and they cannot be purchased moving forward. And these include a few things that I wanted to highlight. The Mayor Pete is a picture book about Pete Buttigieg. Obviously, I haven't read it, but presumably there's no depictions of actual sex acts in there. It's just the fact that the subject is gay. That's the reason that they've decided this book is unacceptable. The Handmaid's Tale, and Because Irony is Dead, 1984, by George Orwell. And I want to emphasize that this is all being done under the guise of parental rights. So this is something that we see across the whole country. It's a sort of a buzzword and catch-all that has been used to assault public schools in any way where you have anyone being taught something that might conflict with conservative religious ideology. They're saying that this is a violation of parental rights because, of course, they want to be in control of what their kids believe. They don't want schools telling their kids things that are going to make them more likely to question what they're being taught at home. And of course, it should be clear that the secular movement is not anti-parental rights. Of course, there's a discussion to be had there about where the reasonable level of parental rights is. That's a whole interesting legal discussion to have. But the important thing to see is that that's not what's going on here. When you're talking about book bans and you're talking about not letting even middle school teachers mention things like sexual orientation and gender identity, this is not about parental rights. This is about forcefully controlling the messages that kids are hearing and censoring controversial topics that shouldn't be controversial from their education. And they're just using parental rights as as kind of a scapegoat, a word to just kind of make people think, yeah, this makes sense. Now, important to mention, and I did put this in earlier, that specifically not included in this book ban is this book. And this is because there's a section that already exists in the Iowa Code that specifically says that religious books shall not be removed from school libraries. So you can't ban the Bible even if the legislature wanted to. And some of you may have seen in other states, we have leaned on situations where they have similar book bans, but they don't specifically exclude the Bible because, well, we are flatly against book bans and just feel like you should have access to religious texts in a public school library. If you're going to pass a book ban law like this, you should have to be even-handed about it. And if you're going to be even-handed about it, the Bible has a lot of trash in there that really is pretty easily meeting the standard of this law. My favorite is Ezekiel 23:20, which some of you are probably familiar with, but if you ever want to get me this, I found this like knitted depiction with a horse. Those of you who already know it will understand why that would be a fabulous gift for me if any of you wants to get me a surprise. So Ezekiel 23:20, as I recall, is there she lusted after her lovers, whose genitals were like that of donkeys and whose emission was like that of horses. So that's my favorite kind of feel-good Bible verse if I had to pick one. And that's of course one of just hundreds and hundreds. When we have made this argument to ban the Bible in other states, we've included just pages and pages with, just voluminous listing of verses that are violating the wording of these statutes. But of course, it's their special book, and they're not going to let that happen. Okay, shifting gears a little bit, I'm going to talk about private school vouchers, and specifically HF 68. And I'm going to spend more time here because I think, from my perspective, private school vouchers are probably the single greatest threat of imposing Christian nationalism onto the country right now. There's all sorts of different avenues, but this is one that I see as being particularly alarming for a couple reasons. One is that the amount of money that is being siphoned from the general funds of state legislatures that ought to be going to public schools is instead being siphoned directly into church bank accounts. And it's billions of dollars that this is going to be happening with. And also, of course, this is forcing taxpayers to pay for religious indoctrination of kids. So when you have a voucher system, you are hurting public schools and sending a message that parents ought to be sending their kids to these superior private schools, which happen to be almost 100% religious. And so the net result of that is that you have parents who feel understandably pressured to send their kids to like the local Catholic school instead of the public school, because among other things, due to this program, the public school is struggling, right? And so it also perpetuates the religious teachings and religious indoctrinations at those private schools. So it's kind of a double whammy with the funding and then also just this forced or coerced indoctrination of kids at private schools. And Christian nationalists definitely see this as a top priority. We actually thought that this was going to be a top priority of theirs a couple years ago in 2021, when there was, Biden was in the White House. So the focus of a lot of these kind of voucher proponents, Betsy DeVos types, shifted from the federal government more to the state governments. And we thought, oh crap, this is going to be a flood of voucher legislation coming our way. And it actually wasn't. We saw a lot of other stuff that is also bad, but I would say less harmful. Things like putting in God we trust in every classroom. That was their objective at the time, which, yeah, it's really bad, but it's not, it doesn't have the same long-lasting impacts as something like a voucher scheme. But I think there's also, it's a tough thing sometimes, because when you're looking at media covering state church issues, something like putting in God we trust on a school classroom, it's so easy to cover that. And it's so easy to get people upset on both sides of it. You just get in there and have that fight, and you've got your story and you move on. With vouchers and so-called school choice, it's a really messy area. It's really in the weeds. It's very detailed and fact specific. And so I think that you're asking more of people to become well informed about vouchers, what's going on, and why they are so bad. So what I'm going to be hoping to do is to share with all of you some of my thoughts about how to, not only why vouchers are such a problem, but how to communicate that to people. Because the reality is, the narrative of school choice has really resonated with a lot of people. A lot of people are frustrated with public schools. And when they hear that, I can have control of my child's education, it's hard to fault them for wanting to support that. So it's important that you are able to kind of educate yourself, become enough of an expert that you can kind of talk people through that, because they really are falling for something there. Now, so in Iowa specifically, with this new program, it's education savings accounts, which is a particular kind of voucher or neo-voucher thing. It doesn't matter. You don't need to get bogged down in what's the difference between an ESA or a traditional vouchers. It comes down to all the same math. And there are already more than 29,000 applications to the new program, which is more than double the expectation, the majority of whom already attend private schools, which is no surprise. And starting in the 2025-26 school year, there's going to be no income limit. So even if you are a billionaire who's already sent your kids to private schools, the government is now going to pick up the tuition for you to do so. And something else that I think is very telling of what's going on. The moment that this passed, a whole group of Catholic schools in Iowa just instantly decided to increase their tuition rates to meet the new amount of funding available. Like, it suddenly became that this amount is how much it costs per pupil to educate them, because why would they leave money on the table? And then the last really important thing I think to notice is that this bill was passed in the very beginning of the session with absolutely minimum fanfare, which is kind of interesting. A lot of the stuff that Governor Reynolds and a lot of governors like to do is they like to get public support and attention for their projects. And this was definitely a big project for her. So you'd think that she would have made as much media attention as possible. She wants her name on this. But I think the thing is that she knew that this is a little bit shaky ground in terms of popularity. She knows what the arguments against it are. And the more exposure there is, the more time for public opposition, the more messy it gets. So instead, I think what obviously happened is toward the end of the prior session, the leadership in the legislature met with Governor Reynolds and decided we are going to come up with a plan and we are going to get this thing passed as quickly and as quietly as possible so that everyone's just going to wake up one morning and say, hey, this bill passed, and no one even knew that it had been in the process. And we did do what we could to help that. So I mentioned playing defense. We have an action alert system I'll mention a little bit later, where when we saw this was on the governor's desk, we have an automated program where anyone who signed up for our action alerts can just click a button and you send something, in this case, to the governor saying, please veto this bill. Good luck with that in this case. But the idea is that you are at least getting on the record, voicing your opposition. And ideally, we try to get in earlier in the process where we have better chances of stopping these types of bills. All right, so let's talk about why vouchers suck. There's a number of reasons, and these are in no specific order, but I would urge you all to just kind of have these as bullet points so that when you hear the school choice narrative and rhetoric come up, you kind of have these ready to go to explain all the problems with vouchers. Because we've had vouchers for a long time. They're new to Iowa, but they're not new to the country in many other states. So we have a lot of knowledge about how they work and what tends to happen. So first and foremost, what I mentioned earlier, this siphons public school funds to unaccountable private religious schools. At the end of the day, that is what vouchers do, and that is why they are a problem. And this is true whether it's an ESA or traditional voucher or a tuition reimbursement program. Those are just, I think of those as basically it's a shell game. You're doing the same thing. You're taking money from taxpayers that ought to be going to public schools, and you're instead giving it to private schools. The only question is what route the money is taking to get there. So it's just like this shell game that you're doing to decide how to go about doing that, but it's mostly a diversion. It's just to get people kind of confused. It is a messy thing. I had someone in Illinois, I wrote an op-ed about vouchers, making all these other points I'm going to make, and the newspaper I sent it to decided not to publish it because they said, well, the thing is you referred to it as a voucher program, and it's technically not a voucher program, it's an educational savings account. I was just like, come on, this is because it really doesn't matter. All right. Another thing, and this was also, I casually mentioned this with Iowa's program, we already know it's true here, the lion's share of vouchers go to kids who are already attending or were going to attend private schools. So the whole narrative of rescuing kids from failing public schools and putting them into these better private schools is largely a myth. Now, you'll find when they need to defend these programs, they will line up storytellers who fit that mold to create this impression that that's what these programs are doing. But by and large, what's happening is that kids who are already going to private schools are just now having their tuition subsidized by taxpayers. That's primarily what's going on. And even if that weren't true, a lot of students, even if you wanted to go to a private school, very often can't. In Iowa, one of the main reasons for that is simply being rural. If you are not in the middle of Cedar Rapids, you might not even have a private school that you can go to. So your public schools are being harmed, and you couldn't send your kid to a private school if you wanted to because there isn't one. And then even if you do, private religious schools, which is the vast majority of them, are exempt from Title VII, and they are generally going to be allowed to discriminate any way that they want to, as long as they provide a religious justification. And they can also discriminate typically based on academics. So if you have a kid who has underperforming test scores, a private school can typically just say, this kid's not up to our standards, and just boot them back to the public school, which of course, if you compare the test scores after that of the two schools, is also going to favor the private school. So again, this idea of school choice is largely a myth when you consider all of that, because you get people like these yahoos who are running the private schools, getting the money, and if they get to choose their students for the most part, then you're out of luck. Also, students with disabilities, I should mention, often run into major problems where on paper, technically, they should have to be accepted into private schools. They shouldn't be allowed to discriminate on that basis, but typically they will find a way to say they don't want to accept that student. All right, number 3, tests. I mentioned test scores. So there is no evidence across the entire country that students who leave public schools, get a voucher, and go to a private school benefit academically. There have been lots of studies trying to really get to the bottom of this, and it's tricky for one thing because private schools are by definition unaccountable, right? This is the whole point of them, is that they're privately run and they are not kind of shackled to government oversight, which could seem like a good thing if you feel like that oversight is the problem with public schools. But the problem is there's no transparency, there's no accountability, no way to know how these students are doing. In lots of states, private schools that get voucher funds don't even report their scores. And then there's also issues like what I mentioned before, where they're choosing their students so they can kind of inflate their scores. And they directly harm public schools by taking these funds. So there's all these factors that ought to be favoring private schools. You would think, looking at this in the abstract, that this is going to make public schools perform very, very badly, and private schools is going to really prop up, but we haven't even seen that. If you did, there would at least be an argument to say, I have objective reason that I want to send my kid to this private school because they perform better. But when proponents have tried to collect that evidence, it never comes out that way. It's at best just kind of a mess. So that argument falls apart. Another big one is that because of the unaccountable nature of voucher schools and voucher programs, they are just ripe for fraud and abuse. The New York Times did this expose a number of years ago on Steve Yarbrough, who's from Arizona, but he was president of the Arizona Senate. He promoted and personally profited from the program, and this was done legally. He had a tuition organization that he formed that was allowed to keep 10% of the funds they got as overhead, which of course went to him, paid millions of dollars to a private company that Yarbrough also owned, paid for his rent, bought him a car, and so on and so on. So this is just, once you see it from that lens, it's so obvious that this is self-serving and it's about self-enriching an individual. This is not about Steve Yarbrough caring for students in Arizona. What it reminds me of is it makes him sound kind of like this guy to me, or that guy, if you're familiar. All right. So this next one, this is something I didn't know about until just a few years ago, and I think this is maybe one of the most under-discussed issues of modern vouchers. The racist history of the modern voucher system. So there was, I think, one exception in Milwaukee that is like, they had a voucher-like program that's really, really old, but if you set that one aside, the precursor to modern vouchers propped up right after Brown v. Board. And the reason was you had public schools in the South who did not want to desegregate, and the US Supreme Court had ordered them to desegregate. So they were really at this tough spot where they basically said, we're going to resist this every way we can because we do not want to do this, and we'll do everything we can. So what school officials or county officials, in Prince Edward County, Virginia, decided to do is they continually defunded their own public schools to make it so they couldn't operate, and finally they actually closed them. And then what they did is they created a voucher scheme where they offered tuition funds to students that they could go to a private school in. And the only private school in the geographic area happened to not allow students of color to attend. So essentially they were saying, all right, if you're going to force us to desegregate our public schools, we're not going to have public schools. We will pay for white kids to go to the white school, and black kids can just not go to school. That was their solution. And so here's a picture of the protest that happened at the time. And it really is, I think, a pretty clear line that things have not changed all that much. Obviously, the primary goal is no longer racial segregation with modern private schools, but it is the same idea of kind of trying to demonize public school kids, and particularly kind of, inner city kids. It's the same rhetoric that's happening, just in a slightly less obvious fashion. All right, and then of course the state church angle. I haven't even really hit on this too hard. That this is of course why FFRF cares so much about this. But it just needs to be said that the vast majority of private schools are religious, including in Iowa. And this is a religious liberty issue when you're talking about vouchers. The religious liberty interest at stake is that of taxpayers. As a taxpayer, you should not be forced to pay for religious education when you don't believe in the religion being taught. Even if you do believe in it, the government should not be forcing people to support religious education, which makes this just fundamentally un-American. And this is actually one of the points with the Establishment Clause that we have tremendously strong historical evidence on. I can talk a little bit later about the kind of changing landscape of the Establishment Clause, which is really it's been turned upside down very recently by the Supreme Court. But we're having to revisit a lot of the historical questions when we're talking about things in public schools, like this coach prayer case that was decided recently and whatnot, where they're really making us go back and say, did the founders really have a problem with football prayer? It's just like, okay, well, this is a difficult thing to argue about. But this particular issue of forcing people to fund religious education, this is actually very well documented. And even Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who notoriously did not get along particularly well, both wrote adamantly on the same side of this, where they said this is absolutely not something that should be allowed in the United States. And I love Jefferson's quote. He said, "To compel a man to furnish funds for the propagation of ideas he disbelieves and abhors is sinful and tyrannical." I love that. And I put that in a brief to the New Jersey Supreme Court when we were debating a similar issue. It was not about public schools, but it was about funding churches. And I feel like that rings true. And if you don't care about what people like Thomas Jefferson say about this issue, then you just frankly don't care about the Establishment Clause or state church separation. So I think this is one of these issues that you have to just say is a fundamental American value of having the freedom to not support religious beliefs you don't believe in. And vouchers do go directly to that. There's a kind of silly legal fantasy for why we're not going to be able to, for instance, challenge the Iowa program on Establishment Clause grounds, which I'd be happy to talk about. But the reality is that when you look at what's really going on here, it is an assault on religious liberty. Okay, now the next thing I want to talk about is a new organization that we've actually formed. And I'm excited about this for a number of reasons, and it's become largely central to my role at FFRF. So FFRF is a 501c3 nonprofit. We're an educational nonprofit, but we have certain restrictions because of being a 501c3. And what we decided to do is to form what is a 501c4, a separate category of the IRS code that allows us to do certain other activities. So the new 501c4 is called the FFRF Action Fund. So primarily this is going to be the lobbying arm of FFRF. FFRF is limited in the amount of lobbying we can do. With the new C4, when we are under the C4 banner, kind of wearing the C4 hat, we can do as much lobbying as we want. So that's one of the primary benefits, and which should make sense if you've been listening to me talking about our focus changing from litigation to more legislation, policy, and education. It's important that we can do lobbying, which just means talking to lawmakers, telling them what we think they should do, and also talking to the public and telling them, educating them and urging them to take political related actions. So that's the primary benefit. The other thing that's cool though is it lets us also do limited electoral work. And as a 501c3, the Freedom from Religion Foundation itself can't touch electoral issues at all. We cannot endorse candidates or parties, and we have always made sure to keep to be very far afield of any potential violation there. We stay really, really far because we don't want to be a test case where, you know, they're like, oh, FFRF has crossed this line when it was really not very close, but they're going to try to make an example of us. Because you'll see churches, for instance, just all over the place, endorsing candidates and parties. You see that nonstop, and we report that to the IRS whenever we see it, which is another reason we want to make sure that we have very clean hands. We don't want to be an organization that is being accused of hypocrisy because we are reporting churches then doing the same thing on ourselves. So what that means is in the past, when someone is running for office, if they're a candidate, even if they also are a public official at the time, a lot of the time we have decided to stay out of discussions and just stay quiet because it could be that you could see our intervention as a form of endorsement or counter-endorsement. So we've kind of said, we'd love to weigh in because they're talking about state church-related things, but because it's a potential electoral angle, we're going to have to stay out of it. And now the C4 can weigh in situations like that as well, which is really nice. So one example of that is this guy who he pretty recently lumped atheists in with a group that some of them are not a surprise, and then one really was a surprise. He was talking about standing up against atheists, arsonists, Marxists, and globalists, I think. And so a lot of us are like, arsonists? What? I hear you on the Marxism, but what do you mean? You know, it's the whole like godless communist thing is, we're all used to hearing that. But the arsonist comparison was new. And so we partnered with a lot of our sister organizations at the Secular Coalition of America and wrote a letter just kind of rebutting the point, which I'm sure he's read carefully and is going to be, you know, more measured in his future. But anyway, it's nice that we can weigh in on a situation like that, even though he's a candidate for office. That's now not going to stop us. Another thing we can do that is electoral related, because this really is indicating to voters who they ought to be supporting or not supporting. But this was something that I think is, we just created it earlier this year, but is really fun to create. And it's a really neat kind of unique program that we have, is a dynamic congressional scorecard. And I wish we could get all of these at the state level. We're not going to be able to do that. I had to build this thing by hand, and it was quite a bit of work. But we have it for the U.S. House of Representatives. We will have it for the Senate as well. It's on our website, and this is just a screenshot so you can kind of see what it looks like, where basically you have the member of Congress there on the left with their state, and they have a color-coded score, which is based on their support of 3 bills that we have flagged: the Do No Harm Act, the Women's Health Protection Act, and the Supreme Court's Ethics and Recusal Rule, which is just 3 bills that we support in Congress. We think anyone who is pro-state church separation ought to be a co-sponsor of these bills. And then also the Congressional Free Thought Caucus is a group of members of Congress who have gotten together and said, we are going to affirmatively, proactively stand up for state church separation. So if you're a member of that caucus, you get bonus points as well. So in order to score a perfect 100, like that one person you can see down there on the bottom, you have to check all of those boxes. You have to be a member of the caucus and support all 3 of those. And then you can see there's a variety. Iowa reps, you could look it up yourself on our website, but I'll spoil it for you. They do not have a good score, which is not shocking. But as time goes on, we're going to be expanding the scorecard, moving it to the Senate as well, and hopefully will be something that will let people go to kind of have a screenshot of time of what your rep has been doing, and it gives you talking points as well. So if you're meeting with them or sending them an email, you can say, hey, I saw that you have a 60 on this FFRF Action Fund scorecard. I'd love to see you bump it up to an 80. Could you become a co-sponsor on this bill? Because a lot of these, you'll see there are situations where it's like they're, you know, co-sponsors of 2 of the bills, but not the 3rd. And so it's like, hey, what's going on with that? It seems like you're on the right page with a number of these things. And the reality is a lot of times it's just a matter of like congressional offices are busy. And if they don't know that their constituents think this is a priority, they don't make it a priority for themselves. But if you bug them about it, and if they see that their color is going to change from, from orange to green, you can actually convince them to sign on to stuff like that. So I think this is a really neat new tool that we have now. Now, moving back to the state level. So when you're in Iowa, the question is, what do you do, and are there perks to being kind of outnumbered, to being in this legislative atmosphere where the legislature has this trifecta that is just hostile to state-church separation? What are you supposed to do? So a couple of the silver linings. Make no mistake, it's bad news. It's not what you want, the situation you want, but there are silver linings. One of them is that virtually every good bill that a legislator is going to put forth in Iowa is going to be a messaging bill. And what that means is they know this bill's not going to pass, right? So what that means is you don't have to be kind of dancing the line of trying to think, well, how can I make this bill a little bit less good, or maybe we throw in something really awful to counterbalance it, and then we can get some people to support it on the other side, so you get these kind of weird bills or really weak bills that have sort of a prayer of passing elsewhere. Instead, it's just like, that's not going to happen. They're not going to give your bill a hearing, so don't bother with any of that. Just put out the bill that you want. And so it allows politicians to actually be very honest about what they think the solutions actually should be. So if you have someone who is your representative, who is a supporter of state-church separation, they're not going to have a lot of power in the legislature, but they do have this ability to really blaze their own path and say, this is a bill that I think ought to be passed here, and maybe ought to be passed somewhere else too. We've seen that in situations where a minority party introduces a bill that seems really kind of, it's just very much pushing the envelope, right? It's a bill that it's like, whew, this is an intense idea that you have here, and this is definitely not going to be seeing the light of day. But then a neighboring state that does not have the same political makeup looks at that and says, hey, this bill makes some sense. I think I could get a version of that to pass here. So you can actually be creating positive outcomes in other states by just setting the example, because you're not shackled by these political realities. And in a similar idea, there are potentially controversial decisions that people who are in sort of purple state situations have to deal with, or even places where there's a majority but it's shaky, it's not rock solid. We've gotten pushback from legislators who've said, I would do something like forming a secular caucus, for instance. We've been pushing for state legislators to form secular caucuses. And we've heard from people in like Michigan and Colorado, for instance, that they say, yeah, we could do that. We have the people who support it, but the problem is our majority is shaky, and this could be seen as anti-religious. And if that costs us potentially one seat, it's a huge net negative. So it's just not worth the risk. We all support state-church separation anyway. We don't need to have a caucus on it anyway. And if we have one person who's in a largely religious district who signs on to something that could be seen that way, this just could be too prickly. So it's that kind of stuff that it's frustrating to hear, but it's because they're trying to navigate a messy political environment, which we don't have here. It's a different scenario in Iowa. So what to do when you are in this situation? My recommendations are, for one thing, you can always focus on local, right? So the federal government is just insanely locked up. You can always get interested and do what you want to, try to have an influence federally, but you're always going to be a small fish in a big pond, and Congress itself is just tremendously deadlocked and is going to be that way for the foreseeable future. So it's not the best place to try to actually get things done, unfortunately. State level here, also difficult, but local, you can always do that. And it's always been good political wisdom to do things from the ground up, right? So you have the most power with your actual physical neighbors. And if you can get some groundswell of support, you and your community can try to turn that into something greater. So I would urge you, first of all, to focus on what you can control, which is your local politics, if anything, local policy. Also, as I mentioned in my opening, instead of trying to accomplish specific goals that are really, really difficult to actually get done, focus on educating people and dispelling cynicism. A lot of the stuff, like for instance, I was talking, the vouchers earlier, a lot of people just don't know the stuff that I talked about earlier. And so if you focus on educating them, you can change their minds because they've only heard a little bit of it, right? They've heard one angle of it. They say, yeah, that makes sense. I'll support this. And so you can get those people to the right side of things if you're committed to educating them. And then cynicism too. I mean, I know so many people who, if you put their feet to the fire, are on what I would call the right side of all these policy issues, but they're just so done with politics that they just don't want to show up to vote. They don't want to engage in any of this stuff. And so they sit everything out. They just focus on other things. And I think a big part of what you can do is to work against that cynicism. Try to get people committed to the idea that there is some value in them showing up. And just kind of fight against the hopelessness that so many people have. We live in one of the most exciting times, for better or worse, in human history. So I'd say whatever you do, don't be bored. And try, when you see bored people, just rattle them out of it. Get them interested. And then finally, manage expectations, right? Like I said, you're not going to be able to just overturn the new Iowa voucher system next year, right? Not going to happen. That's okay. You shouldn't be expecting that. You have to take stock of what you can actually try to accomplish and persevere. Just keep working at it. You have to be okay with small victories. The other thing you can do, of course, is there is potential bipartisan legislation. And I think some people are going to be rolling their eyes at the idea of getting anything that would have bipartisan support through the Iowa legislature, but we've seen it in other states. And so I have a few examples here, and there are more. Things like we have secular recovery bills, which this is the idea that if you have someone who is in the criminal court system and has a substance use disorder issue with alcohol or narcotics, and the court orders them to attend something like a 12-step program like Alcoholics Anonymous, some people don't know that there is a religious aspect to that program, or even if they do, they're not going to be comfortable telling the judge, hey, I would really rather not go to that program. I'd like an alternative that's not religious, which you absolutely do have that right. So what this bill would do is it would just require judges to ask people, do you have an objection to the religious nature of this program? And if they say yes, you find them something else that works. And a lot of even religious conservative legislators are fine with this because they see alcoholism as a major problem. They see the opioid epidemic, and they want to give people multiple pathways to recovery. They want everyone to have whatever is the best shot at getting them so that they are not struggling with this anymore. So that's an example. We're pushing for that in New York, Michigan, Colorado, and we're drafting a bill in Florida, and we have seen some bipartisan support for that. Healthcare transparency, I can talk more about that if people want to know, but this is these bills mostly have to do with healthcare sharing ministries, HCSMs, which are like this fake insurance that usually have a religious bend, and they tend to just basically defraud their customers by not paying out health benefits. So they're billed as an alternative to insurance, but they're actually just much worse than traditional health insurance. And so this works toward fixing that problem. It's a consumer protection thing. A lot of conservative legislators are on board. And medical aid in dying is another one. So this is, of course, the idea that if you are a person who is still of sound mind, but you have a terminal diagnosis, rather than being forced to let that disease run its course, you can instead have a doctor who is comfortable being a part of this prescribe you medicine that will allow you to end your life in the way and the time that you choose. This is something else too that most people, especially if they've ever encountered someone who's been in this situation, it transcends political biases. Once they get a good storyteller, or if they've been in this situation themselves, or they have a relative in this situation, we've had a lot of people who say, absolutely, I support this, even though I don't like anything else that FFRF does, I will support this one. So it's a few ideas. So we are trying to do the same thing that I was just urging all of you to do, trying to go back to basics, remind people, why does church-state separation matter in the first place? So just examples of things we're doing: we file amicus briefs, we publish books, op-eds, law review articles, social media, other media, and we even did a law symposium in Rhode Island, and we're working on another one to try to educate law professors and law students on some of these topics. Just really quickly, going back to the federal courts, consider that Justice Kavanaugh is now the person you're pretty much going to have to convince if you want to win anything at the Supreme Court. That gives you an idea of the uphill battle you have there with whatever comes up. And nowadays, a quarter of all federal appellate judges are Trump appointees. So when I was talking about, the Eighth Circuit, across the whole country, most of the circuits are dominated by Trump appointees. Biden has been doing a good job of appointing a lot of judges, but the problem is for the second half of his term, and even if he gets a second term, there just aren't enough vacancies for him to catch up to all the packing that Trump and McConnell did. So unless we expand the judiciary, which we absolutely should do, this is just going to be the reality for quite a while. With Iowa, there are 5 federal judges between the two districts. And if you consider how many things come up that those 5 judges have to deal with, justice delayed is justice denied, as they say, right? So if you have a federal issue come up, and the dockets for these 5 judges is massive. They are very badly overworked. These are trial-level judges. They just have so much before them that when it's not unusual, if you file a federal lawsuit, for it to take 5 or 6 years before you get a final result, after it bounces like to the Eighth Circuit and back. And if it goes to the Supreme Court, it could take a decade or more. So that's not serving anyone well. And it's another reason that if we just had more people to do the job, it would go much better. So that also, it ought to be a bipartisan issue to expand the judiciary. We used to do it more regularly. It's been a long, long time now, but it's hard because there's just so much thought into, well, who's going to be appointing all these judges if we expand it? So Congress just won't do it. All right, now I'm just going to fly through this kind of quick. So this session, my team tracked more than 1,400 bills across all 50 states, which is quite a lift. And fortunately, we have software that helps us kind of manage that, so we're not doing it manually, but still, it's a lot to keep track of. And for most state legislatures, it is the early part of the year where they are meeting and making these decisions. For Iowa, it's the first half of the year, but then there are special sessions that can happen as well. And the last couple things I want to say before we switch to Q&A or other issues you guys would just like to pick my brain on is persevere. Don't give up the fight. And remember, if nothing else, something I like to remind myself on, remember that demographics are largely on our side, both as just trying to get progressive policies done broadly, and also in terms of trying to shake the hold of religion in public policy. It's comforting to know that younger people who are kind of, coming into voting age are less religious and more in support of a lot of what we, consider progressive ideals than older people are. And so I think on a lot of these, the issues that are kind of culture war hot topics right now, in some period of time, it's hard to know when, but at some period of time, it's going to be similar to the gay marriage issue, and before that, the school segregation issue, where it's like this was hotly contested for so long, and then it just reaches this tipping point where if you come out, I worry we're backsliding on the gay marriage thing, but for sure, if you were to come out and say, I support, resegregating schools because of my Christian belief, no one is going to support that, right? No one is going to want to be affiliated with you if you come out and say something like that. That would just be absolute political suicide. And I think we're going to be reaching that point on a number of other issues too. But it's going to take some time. And the more we can educate people and keep people galvanized to do things, the faster we're going to bring that about. So that's my main ask of all of you, is just stay energized, stay interested, and to the extent that you can, try to get people around you interested and involved as well. So with that, I'm happy to take questions people have. Thank you.